There's so much sex appeal to building new things. And like in 10 years, we'll have this really cool new autonomous thing, drone, walking, humanoid that's going to solve all of these problems. But the problem is there's a lot of issues going on today. And so the approach to solving and using, specific robots for specific jobs is actually just to earn the right to begin building really cool robots that are able to do more interesting things. But you got to get the business model right. And the business model has to incentivize and make a CEO or a CFO give a fuck about how useful these industry 4.0 principles and tools are. Because right now that's not true. I see this time and time again where I won't name the AI companies, but these AI companies come in and say, we'll completely turn on your head the way you're operating your entire business. And they'll come in for some contract that ends up expiring because it just did not produce. And that's the problem. You think you have all the information and data, but you're building your AI and your solutions off of ground truth. It's actually not ground truth.
This Week in Startups is brought to you by Vanta. Compliance and security shouldn't be a deal breaker for startups to win new business. Vanta makes it easy for companies to get a SOC 2 report fast. Twist listeners can get $1,000 off for a limited time at vanta.com/twist. DevSquad. Most dev agencies only offer developers. Why? Because product management is hard. Get an entire product team for the cost of one US developer plus 10% off at devsquad.com/twist. And Hubspot Podcast Network. Hubspot Podcast Network presents a new podcast called The Next Wave. The Next Wave is your personal chief AI officer, bringing fresh takes, industry insights, and a trustworthy perspective on how to implement AI to grow your business. Just search for The Next Wave on YouTube or in your favorite podcast app. That's The Next Wave.
All right. Welcome back to another episode of This Week in Startups. We like to talk about innovation here, and AI has been on everybody's minds for the last 2 years. It's just simply brilliant what AI can do, and we see it improving every week. Of course, there has been this dread of, oh my God, what if AI plus robotics gets put together and we have the Terminator films? The truth is, autonomous robots are coming and they will have AI built in. You've probably seen Figure or what Elon's working on with Optimus over at Tesla. This is going to change the world in my belief. And today we have a company that's been working on it for a little while. It's called Gecko Robotics. We have the CEO here. His name is Jay Loosararian. So tell me about the robots you're building. And for those of you not watching This Week in Startups on YouTube or the video version on Spotify, you can go over to YouTube, just type in This Week in Startups, hit the subscribe button. You'll find this video there under the videos tab, and you can actually see what we're talking about here. Yeah, tell me what you're building with Gecko.
Thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to dive in on one of my favorite topics, with robotics and artificial intelligence and how it impacts the world. But started in college. I started a robotics company out of college when I saw firsthand actually the state and how the physical world that we rely on every single day collapses and isn't always there for you. And this happened at a power plant where I got to see firsthand where power plant was having these massive shutdowns. And the best way to stop it was sending a human into a data environment and trying to predict when these built structures, in particular this boiler, was going to fail. And the best way to do that was sending a human into a dangerous environment. The same year I'd gone there, someone had fallen and died doing this job. It's dirty, dangerous, and not typically talked about. And so I built a wall climbing robot in college to solve for the K of critical infrastructure that we care, that we rely on so deeply to live our lives every single day. So 11 years after that, now here I am, still working on the same critical mission of protecting and helping to build new infrastructure, but more intelligently.
So these are purpose-designed robots to do very specific tasks. You're not taking the approach that Elon's taking at Tesla or the Figure robot is taking of specifically a humanoid robot. These are robots that are designed for a specific function, like climbing up and inspecting a building, correct?
The whole premise was, it seems like we don't care that deeply, or at least know that much about the built world that we rely on. And that was the thought, when I was in college. Hey, we go over a bridge every day. Hey, we rely on power plants. We rely on manufacturing facilities, ships to carry supplies all around the world. How do we know if those things are going to be around or there for us? Is it the right assumption to believe that the bridge I'm crossing is, going to be structurally sound and not going to collapse? And
so that's where you started the journey. You said, hey, infrastructure is the ideal customer profile for your startup and for this product, Robotics. Your customer is essentially infrastructure, and specifically infrastructure in the United States, which for whatever reason, we seem to have not allocated enough resources towards.
Yeah, it's in 2013 when I was in college designing the first robot, I've read this report. It said 3.4% of GDP around the world was spent on fighting corrosion. I was like, wow, that's a crazy $3.5 trillion number. I wonder why that is. Then you look into these interesting reports that show the U.S. is at like a D grade in terms of its infrastructure, and it costs trillions of dollars just to keep it there, and not to improve it, but just to keep it there,
maintain it.
Yeah, maintain it, and that's regardless of building new things. So it started with the critical industries and infrastructure, but it was mostly this thought that was, wow, we seem like we talk as if we know a lot and have a lot of data about how the built world works and how to make it better, but that's actually very far from true for the physical world. For example, we don't know if a concrete structure like a bridge is going to be sound and going to be there, and how long will it last. The bridges and infrastructure that we rely on was not built for the kind of traffic and loads that we currently are demanding on it today.
So we're stressing the infrastructure on top of it. It was built for,
that's right.
The Golden Gate Bridge was built at a time when a certain amount of vehicles would go over it, a certain amount of weight of those vehicles. And obviously, we've induced a lot more usage of that with a lot heavier vehicles. So maybe you could show us and Sportscast one of these robots doing inspections. And I know that you're not just doing infrastructure. You've got energy, defense, manufacturing, other robots and other verticals you're flying in. But I would love to see what these robots are, and then get into the business model, because it is This Week in Startups, of how you make money with these robots. Yeah,
absolutely. When I was in college, looked around, and like I was describing, there seemed to be this world that technologists and startups didn't really pay that much attention to. It's the world of energy. It's the world of manufacturing. It's the world of defense and public infrastructure. And I saw this up close and personally with the power sector, and it was just this idea of, man, we don't really have that much data on the built world, and thus it makes it really hard to know and understand how to predict how it's going to perform.
And what you're showing on the screen here is the Golden Gate Bridge. I assume a nuclear reactor, and then it looks like a really either another type of bridge, and inspectors literally rappelling up and down them, which is dangerous, exactly right. And I'm sure quite expensive. I don't know what those individuals get paid, but they're getting paid half as much as they should. What does a person get paid to rappel off of a nuclear power plant or the Golden Gate Bridge? What do they make? $100 an hour? $50 an hour? Do you know? You must know.
It's about, it depends on the level, but it's about in between $30 and $70 an hour.
That's it?
It's probably, it's even,
$30
even gets a little
an hour
lower.
is $60,000 a year, just times about 2,000.
Super low. Pathetic. Over time you can get a little higher, but it's exactly right. This is a spherical tank, for example, at a oil and gas refinery. But just this, you enter this world, most folks who are starting technology companies or in robotics or AI, have never stepped foot on at a refinery, or don't really know the first thing about structural and material science, or what are the hundreds of different types of corrosion instead of steels or instead of concretes. But these all are really important. Not just to predict and ensure that we're not suffering from some sort of catastrophic failure, which actually has environmental as well as just functional implications, but also how do you actually modulate how you're operating the infrastructure to actually get more out of the let's say the power plant or the refinery, while also reducing the amount of greenhouse emissions that are being released by the company, because whenever there's a catastrophic failure of a pipeline, guess what? A lot of explosion leads to unfiltered carbon emitted right into the atmosphere. And the worst recorded environmental incident was the Nord Stream pipe exploding, for example, or these deep water horizon events. So ensuring that you don't have these catastrophic failures is actually really important as it relates to net zero and those things. But so the story was 10 years ago in college, and basically came across this weird problem of power plants having these shutdowns and someone had died.
Listen, a strong sales team can make all the difference for a B2B startup. But if you're going to hire sharks, you need to let them hunt, and you can't slow them down with compliance hurdles like SOC 2. What is SOC 2? Well, any company that stores customer data in the cloud needs to be SOC 2 compliant. If you don't have your SOC 2 tight, your sales team can't close major deals. It's that simple. But thankfully, Vanta makes it real easy to get and renew your SOC 2 compliance. On average, Vanta customers are compliant in just 2 to 4 weeks. Without Vanta, it takes 3 to 5 months. Vanta can save you hundreds of hours of work and up to 85% on compliance costs. And Vanta does more than just SOC 2. They also automate up to 90% compliance for GDPR, HIPAA, and more. So here's your call to action. Stop slowing your sales team down and use Vanta. Get $1,000 off at vanta.com/twist. That's vanta.com/twist for $1,000 off your SOC 2. A charming backstory if there ever was one. Show us the robot.
Okay, all right.
Hey, show us the robot. We want to see this thing in action.
Okay,
every founder's got a charming story. Do you have a PR team that helped you craft that, or that's the authentic story?
This is me. No, this is me.
The authentic story. Okay.
Yeah, so
I believe you.
The first robot was one that was climbing up a wall and gathering information, visual and ultrasonic. Basically, what we're looking at, what I was looking at this 10 years ago was, what is the structural integrity of the pressure vessel, and how do you ensure that you're understanding, just like you're doing a CAT scan or doing a sonogram, you use high frequency sound wave to look inside of a material without needing to open it up and destroy the surface.
So what we're seeing on the screen is a robot that's about the size of a pool cleaner with a tether, and it's zipping up and down some pipes, and it's open, so you can see all the innards of it. It looks like an insect crawling along the pipes. That's the size of a pool cleaner, like I said. Am I about right?
The robot's, it's about the size of a briefcase. And it comes in a couple different forms, but basically adhering.
Yeah, because it's upside down and it's gripping. Is it suction cups, magnets? What is it doing there?
So it's climbing up surfaces, whether it be an outside of a ship, or let's say some sort of piping, or a dam even. We'll use neodymium rare earth magnets arranged in a Hallbach array. And that maximizes pull force into a surface to allow for payloads to be added onto the robots. And they're collecting different kinds of data layers. One of the data layers, for example, is this ultrasonic data layer that's looking at what's the structural integrity, corrosion, erosion of the surface, to get generalized idea of what is the health of this, just like you would do a picture of a belly using a sonogram test for a pregnancy.
Wow. So do humans do this when they're climbing up and down? When we saw them rappelling, do they have some device that they do this manually with?
Yeah, they do. So basically our savior today is Joe on a rope. But basically it's these guys. These guys are our best defense. The guys who are hanging off ropes or climbing on scaffolding or on JLGs. And they're armed with single probes that you use some gel. You squirt the gel on a surface, let's say on kilometers of pipeline. You'd squirt gel every 10 meters, every 1 meter, depending on the criticality. And then you use the ultrasonic sensor and you record the waveform. And then because if you understand the speed of sound through that material, you can actually understand what's the thickness of that material. And then you could use, and then you record that down on a piece of paper or in an Excel sheet. And basically, that's the way that we understand how the built world works.
They're taking a sample, but you're taking continuous, so you have the full picture. It's possible, in fact, probable, that the humans are going to miss most issues. Am I correct? That they're going to miss most or some?
They're going to miss a fair amount, or there's actually human error as it relates to interpreting the waveforms. But there's other kinds of techniques that you either are or are not using. So visual is one, just like, hey, this thing looks like it's leaking. That's bad. Or with around welds, you have to do certifications of welds on critical pipelines, for example, and you're using X-rays. Interpreting the X-ray is actually pretty difficult, and it's also super dangerous because you're using something that can cause cancer if you're not appropriately operating it. So we actually will put on the robots something called phased array, which is basically ultrasound, but just hundreds of different sound waves going into a very small area. You can apply basically these different payloads onto the robots to look at corrosion, look at cracking, look at generalized erosion. But then you can also add other kinds of information. You can use electromagnetics to look at what's the damage over top of some substrates that you have to remove some sort of insulation. So.
Got it.
Anyway, what you're trying to solve for the customer is how do you reduce the downtime or the time I'm spending not making my product. And so that's what you're trying to first help the customer understand is how do you ensure that you are solving this problem of ensuring that there's not going to be some catastrophic event, but limiting the amount of time you're not making your product. And so the robots are going into these like missile silos, for example, or on top of flight decks on destroyers. It's climbing inside of power plants at boilers. It's going onto dams using suction and adhesion and there. But basically, we've gone from like what you just saw in terms of the robot climbing up a wall, looking at corrosion and erosion, and we've now like combined that into a bunch of different robots. Some of which are doing this climbing, some of which are using just like drones that are looking at using photogrammetry to understand what is like in general. When we do a quick analysis of potential damaged areas over like large geographical area, or maybe integrating like a walking dog, and then you can use fixed sensors to continually monitor. You know what this reminds me of?
This reminds me of the Pronovo full body scan. Which a lot of doctors will say, hey, you don't need it. It's going to cause you to find things, nodules, little things, growths in your body. You're not going to know what they are, and you might panic and get anxiety. And I'm like, well, wait, but what if it is something and you live longer because you found, some, God forbid, cancer or tumor early or something with your brain? I would much rather have that. Therefore, you are going to inspect these things and have an image in time. And then you can look for the deltas and what's changed between the two imaging. So if you were to do this every year on the Golden Gate Bridge, what would be the frequency that the Golden Gate Bridge or, a submarine should have this done to it?
So what we're actually working on, I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania right now, which is where I started the company, did 3.5 years of bootstrapping it down to like $100 mega account. Ended up choosing to go to YC opposed to an acquisition offer. Went out to California against all investors, like desires, came back to Pittsburgh, close to customers, was able to grind closer to there. In Pittsburgh, though, what's interesting, there's so many bridges. It was where 69% of the world's steel was built here. And now it's kind of reinventing itself in terms of like this robotics and AI hub. But what's exciting is it's actually a really great state as it relates to the political support to try and utilize technologies like Geckos to do things like create the most sophisticated bridge evaluation and infrastructure process. There's we're still working with the governor actually on an initiative with bridges. But to answer your question,
you want to be able to look how often you got to inspect a bridge?
You want to be able to look at a bridge. You'd want to look at it with a deep scan, like we would do, like a full health. Like here's exactly what's going on with the entire bridge. Maybe like once every 5 years. You don't want to like look at it every year. You actually, though, like once you understand the general health, similar to how you would do like with a human, you would then use fixed sensors that are enabled by Wi-Fi or 5G, and then those are constantly updating a digital twin, and that actually like this.
Explain what a digital twin is for people. Yeah.
So digital twin it's represented in software. It's 3-dimensional. You can manipulate it, but it needs to update itself. So it needs to be continually updating with information, whether that information is the health of the asset or how the asset is performing.
So an example for a bridge might be a real world example you've come across might be?
Yes, a real world example is a tank. So a tank at, let's say, a pulp and paper manufacturing place, a place where we all get our toilet paper. So we have a really big contract with this company that's interested in extending the useful life of their tanks. But then what they want to do is instead of, the tank is 20 years old, you have to, it's past its useful life. So we have to build a new one. And we come in and say, actually, you don't need to. We'll take, this tank plus 50 other tanks that look similar to this. And we'll tell you how to make it last 10 years longer or even 20 years longer. We'll tell you exactly what to repair. And Jason, we're actually, because we now have this information on the health and structural integrity of some of the world's most critical infrastructure, like 500,000 assets. That's where we use AI.
Hey, take a moment. Picture the ultimate all-star team for your startup. You got that image? Maybe you're thinking about the Avengers, huh? Maybe the X-Men, Wolverine, Cyclops, Iron Man. Well, let's be realistic here. Until you've raised your Series A or B, you're going to need help building this A team, right? You may not have all the resources to do it. Finding talent, managing all these timelines, and ensuring quality is a huge task for anybody building a product. And scouting for the perfect all-in-one 10x developer, it's going to take a lot of time. Well, there's somebody out there who does this for a living. Skip the hassle and power up with DevSquad. Okay? They're like Professor X from the X-Men. They just know where all those great mutant developers are, those really powerful ones. DevSquad offers a complete product team loaded with top-tier talent straight from Latin America. Same time zone as us, right? Your team is going to have 2 to 6 full-stack developers, depending on what you need, a technical product manager, keep everything tight, and a bunch of specialists. Maybe you need UI and UX design. Maybe you need DevOps. How about quality assurance? They're all going to be synced up in your time zone, and it's going to cost 75% less than the equivalent team in the USA. We all know there's an incredible arbitrage. There's talent everywhere in the world. And now that we all work online, remote, hybrid, whatever it is, you know that you can integrate this amazing DevSquad team into your team. If you're looking for seamless collaboration and the flexibility of monthly payments without long-term commitments, well, it's time to take action. Head over to devsquad.com/twist and snag an exclusive 10% off your engagement. That's DevSquad, DevSquad.com/twist. It's time to squad up and transform your startup with the all-star team you deserve. So let's take a look at a digital twin then. I'm assuming you can show me one, or? Yeah, because this is fascinating. Sure. You inspect this container, right? And let's say it's got, you didn't give the exact example of what you would continuously monitor in the digital twin, but I'm assuming maybe there's some area where you think it might get fractured or be compromised. And so you put a sensor on that permanently.
Yeah.
That sends a continuous reading to let you know if it's getting worse. And at what point you think it's going to explode or crack or fail, which would be the equivalent of like in a human body, just monitoring some, tumor that might be benign or might not be benign. Am I correct? That's right. Framing here?
That's right. But you also, so this orients towards the business model too. It's like, we started building robots and they're really exciting and cool. What we ended up finding was that just building robots and using the robot as a service, we don't actually sell the robots. We're going out to site with the robots and getting data and then giving it to the customer.
Got it.
What we ended up finding was that wasn't a model that actually oriented towards value creation. So we were creating outsized returns in some cases, like 9, and even there was even a case of a $500 million value creation because we stopped this like crazy explosion at this refinery, the biggest refinery in the US. Because they had gotten faulty information from the guy on the rope, Joe. What we ended up doing was, charging them like a couple $100,000 for this. And that was crazy because how outsized the value creation was. So what we ended up also finding was there was the lack of ability to take action on the data to improve how the customer was operating their assets. So let me walk you through that. So what we'll do is we'll have a suite of different robotics that we offer and work with the customer to try and solve around a problem. In this case, it was how do I manage 50 of my most important pressure vessels and tanks for this customer? And about 5 years ago, we started developing Cantilever, which is our enterprise software. So when a customer buys Gecko, they're buying enterprise software, and that's called Cantilever. And what they're getting from that is a solution oriented towards a very specific problem for that customer set. So we actually not only had to become experts on robotics and AI and software, but we also had to become experts on like our customer's actual problem, both upstream and downstream. I'll take you through an example of which
I'm assuming you got by asking them questions in customer interviews and saying, well, what are you going to do with this data? We've now given you the data, and they told you, hey, well, we need to make this decision when to retire this tank. And then it became, your business becomes not selling a robot or selling an inspection. Your business is now extending the life of tanks.
That is one of the important value outcomes, yes. But it also was like in the beginning, like I had to like spend all my days and time at the customer sites and just like living and understanding their problems like better than they could. And did that for not just power plants, but manufacturing facilities like places that are making steel or places that are making aluminum, places that are refining oil, that are operating a hydroelectric dam. Like we have to end up going into these industries and understanding exactly what they're trying to produce and from a first principles, what goes into both the like good and poor outcomes. And then also understanding where they are getting value and can pull value, like from a regulation standpoint. It gets really complicated. So So for this customer,
we call this technique, by the way, in the business, a bear hugging. So when you have a customer who's like a key customer, you give them that big bear hug, which means you get on location, you spend time with them. I learned this from a company we're investors in called Density.io that does people counting. And when you are on site, you will overhear things, and you're going to have the customer, just through the course of hanging out with them, give you insights that you're not going to get in a 20-minute customer interview. You might get them, but in all likelihood, just hanging out at the facility or maybe having even a drink or having lunch with folks, at some point, you're going to have these epiphany moments. Yeah. And that's what happened for you.
Yeah, 100%. But also like you can codify that into a business model. So,
sure.
One of our Series A investor was Founders Fund.
Wow.
Trey Stevens is our partner and board member there. But what was interesting is while we took a trip to the UAE in like 2020. It was literally right before COVID. We almost got stuck actually in Oman, I think it was. He ended up just talking through Palantir in the early days and how he's helped set up the Palantir office in the Middle East. We ended up talking deeply about forward deployed engineering, and I was like, "Wow, this is so cool that they have like taken this approach." Forward deployed engineering is you send out your engineers on deployments as an implementation team of the software you sold, and then you work alongside customers to understand their problems to help create the software modules that are oriented towards the solutions that the customer is actually trying to solve. Because in reality, when you deal with these industries, they're so complex. These problems are so complex, and they're so hesitant to either communicate or even to talk about like the different problems that exist in these like Manhattan-sized environments. Like the size of refineries, the size of Manhattan, and so there's like so many different things. Bells like variable frequency drives that like need to be like looked at and wrench turned in this way, and all these like nuances. And this is actually one of the big issues as well, is that there's these people that rely on every single day are completely they're reaching this point of phasing out, whether they're dying or retiring, and there's a huge knowledge gap. So anyway, they began to think about what if actually we took like the early learnings of forward deploying our roboticists in combination, in concert with forward deployed software engineers, to actually build a vertically integrated stack of data collection of various types and a lot of it. So we call them data layers, and then pull all that into a single source of truth, a data warehouse, and then deliver the modules and software to solve customer problems, but do so located actually alongside customers, because you have to convert someone into using a different system. You actually have to help build it alongside of them.
Yeah.
So anyway,
and the current system was probably pencil and paper, pictures, and stuff scattered across disparate systems, I'm assuming. Yeah.
That's right. And inconsistent, like per site. So like Marathon, they might have 7 refineries, and each of those refineries operates completely differently because they're both producing $20 billion each or something like that.
You didn't show us the actual digital twin. Let's make sure we show that. Yeah.
Of course.
We got sidetracked there.
Yeah.
No, it's so fascinating what you're doing. It's easy in an interview like this to get sidetracked into all the different nuggets of what you're discovering as a founder. But I did want to see the digital twin concept.
Okay, let's do it. Yeah. So you start with like, what problem are you trying to solve? Well, we're trying to solve for, increasing life extension, or understanding like how to fix like 50 tanks and manage 50 tanks. All right. Sounds good. So the outcomes we were able to solve for, I'll just skip that to the end. Basically, customer will say like, okay, customer, I need your metadata as it relates to the structures that we're going to go out and try to evaluate. So they'll send us the metadata, and then we'll incorporate that inside of Cantilever as we build out their profile. And so we're delivering using just drawings, what is a very rudimentary digital twin. And so this is an example of a 3D representation of a tank using the dimensions of the customer. Then you send out your robot fleet. And so the robots go out there and they're climbing all over these structures, and they're trying to evaluate what is the health of this tank, and doing so as quickly as possible while the tank is actually in operation. So you don't have to shut the thing down. And then you understand what the health of that structure is. This one was pretty bad. Red is good, for example. Green is bad. And it looks really pixelated because as the robot's climbing, it's pulsing the area it's climbing over hundreds of times every single inch. And then you can either look at what's the mean in terms of the how structurally sound or how healthy that area is, like an inch by inch grid, or you can look at the data in other ways. But you want to label all that data set because it'll be very helpful as it relates to what kind of corrosion is going on.
For whatever reason here, when you're looking
And
at this
root
tank
cause.
shell, the bottom 25% of the tank is green.
Yeah, so the bottom is actually super healthy, is what you're seeing. So the red's
green is
bad.
healthy. Red is not
green
healthy.
Yeah.
All right. AI is moving really fast, and we're seeing it in all aspects of our lives, in business, personally. And you know what? It's okay to be confused by all of this. I found a great podcast for you that's perfect at helping you navigate all things AI. It's called The Next Wave, and it's brought to you by the Hubspot Podcast Network. The hosts, Matt Wolf and Nathan Lands, both have an insane level of AI expertise because they both founded and invested in AI companies. So think of The Next Wave as your personal chief AI officer. That's right, serving up fresh perspectives, industry insights, tools, tips, and tricks on how to use AI to grow your business. That's the most important part, tactical advice to actually put AI to use in your business. Check out the episode, The Large Language Model Race, with Peter Huang, founder of the Neuron. Pete covers the latest AI developments, trends, and research, including a fresh take on where AI and your creativity collide, its impact on industries like music and entrepreneurship, the balance between innovation and ethics, and the rising capabilities of LLMs. So here's your call to action. Super easy. I want you to go search for The Next Wave on YouTube or your favorite podcasting app and subscribe and discover how to leverage AI to unlock new opportunities for your business. Brought to you by the HubSpot YouTube network. So the base is healthy, but the top 75% for some reason is really weathered. I don't know if that's caused by wind or the ground is painted or covered. What would cause that weird pattern?
So what we found is like it's very correlated with how you operate the tank. And so this is a really important tank, and they were typically filling their tank halfway up. And this was like a very common method, in fuel storage tanks, for example, that you're filling your fuel storage tanks if you're Exxon like 40% of the way up, because you just don't want everything to like collapse and spew like a bunch of oil into a river somewhere. But which is actually not good, because you're actually destroying the asset in a certain way, and you're reducing the capacity you can run at, and how much oil
so they were scared of a disaster, so they made a decision that increased the likelihood of a disaster. So good intent, bad outcome.
That's right. But also, for one of our customers, ADNOC, which is the UAE's national oil company, we just signed a $30 million deal with them. But the big thing they're trying to solve for is, how do I produce more oil per day, barrels per day, go from 3.5 million to 5 million barrels per day. But what we're trying to also show is that you can reduce the potential carbon emissions while also increasing your throughput if you just operate your assets more intelligently. So we'll get into like exactly what that means. But you don't have to actually build new things necessarily, which is a huge deal. Then you send in robots that can do evaluations, again, while the tank is in operations in a submerged way. And so you're looking at what's the structural integrity of the floor, because the floor is actually one of the most compromised areas. And so the green, again, is good, the red is bad, and you want to try and evaluate where to fix things. And then you use LiDAR to look at what's the depression of the tank, because it's really heavy. And so it'll begin to depress in certain locations, which can also lead to a bunch of issues. So LiDAR is really important. And there's like different kinds of like rules and regulations that different bodies set out. And then we'll create these repair plans. And so that's what that's trying to do, is help the customer understand how much capital to deploy, and then like how many years you get from the life extension. So what we'll do is we'll use the data that we're collecting from this tank, the other 50 tanks at that site, and then also the thousands of other assets that look just like this, to try and evaluate where's the areas that you want to fix right now to extend the useful life of the asset. But then once you do that, you have to send it back to the real world. So it goes physical, digital, physical. So it has to be an output where there's an action being taken from the insights. The digital twin is actually helping to be used by folks that are welding and doing repairs, for example, or like trying to make like an actual like functional decision around how to operate the asset. In this case, the tank. But then we'll install fixed sensors that are pinging the digital twin every day.
And these are those black little circles around the compromised area. One of the rings of this, you think of it like a barrel, is compromised. Right. So you're putting sensors on it that tell you what?
It'll look at the structural integrity. So it'll ping you every day, because corrosion actually doesn't happen linearly. It happens typically in these like weird moments of large decay over short periods of time. Typically that's related to like what kind of chemical is in the, let's say into the tank that may be abnormal, or maybe there's some sort of, it's really windy and rainy like that month, or there's a lot of sodium in the air and that's like causing a lot of like increased corrosion. If you're like by a gulf, for example, it also
like people say, how did it happen? Slowly, then all at once.
Yeah.
It's slowly degrading, and then some event happens, and all at once it gets compromised. Is generally aviation, bankruptcy, and structural failures all seem to go in that direction. Suddenly, slowly, then all at once.
That's exactly right. And there are some root causes that you can begin to understand. So you might get a shipment of like new fuel or a new chemical, and that there might be actually a compromise in the quality of that.
Yeah,
this is actually an issue as well with you manufacture new things. Like windmills are falling over in Germany right now because of poor steel quality. And so like you end up having this like issue where you might be getting like really inefficient process for some reason, but you can actually tell when that inefficiency is occurring or when there's like an imbalance of chemicals in your in your processing batch that you want to be able to react to, and that's like something that's not predictable. It's reactive.
People started coming to you saying, "Hey, we're installing this new thing. We want to have a day one inspection, so we have a benchmark. And so if it was installed improperly, we can, before we make the final payment to the construction group, we want you to do the inspection of the work done." Has that started to happen?
It has, and actually has happened with the $132 billion Columbia class nuclear sub program, as well as other sub work. So we're working with the Navy actually on new builds and manufacturing. And so what's happening is
them when they're in dry dock.
So inspecting them while they're being built, actually. So what ended up happening was, so on the government side, the defense side, schedule adherence is like a really big problem, as well as like if you're paying $132 billion for new subs, 12 new ones, you want to make sure your tax dollars are actually being used for building good things with high integrity. So we're actually building out digital twins of the sub as it's being constructed and looking at the quality of welds, because that just recently caused like a 6-month delay in a process where they had to take sections of the sub apart. So anyway, this is like priority one right now, on the manufacturing of new sub side, and then we also do some work with the Navy. We just got we've got a pretty large.
You have a digital twin of the sub. You have a digital twin of the battleship.
Not that I can show you, but we're doing this as well with. Actually, it's an interesting program I can show you real quick, but we're beginning to use the same kind of tech philosophy as it relates to concrete. So what we're doing for the U.S. Air Force is we're sending our robot, a different form factor robot with leveraging the stack that we developed to climb up nuclear missile silos. So there's 450 in the U.S. And what's going on right now with the Sentinel program is about $125 billion are being deployed to upgrade the Cold War era nuclear deterrent system of these ICBMs in silo. But what's happening is the concrete's beginning to decay and crumble. It's actually causing these. And in Oklahoma, there was this oxidation explosion actually in one of the ICBM missile silos, which you don't want oxidation explosions inside of a nuclear chamber. So
generally speaking, explosions plus nuclear weapons, not a good combination.
Not a good combination. So we got sole sourced on work. It'll be about $250 million project.
Congrats.
But it's but what you're looking at is we want to understand there's a steel liner and then a concrete liner, like 5 feet of concrete. You want to understand what's the structural integrity of the concrete and like where all the issues are occurring, and then what's the structural integrity of the steel. And then you can figure out, okay, now I can create a plan to fix all this stuff.
Amazing.
So anyway, there's like these interesting applications as it relates to like new builds as you're referring to.
And you're
back to the example.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. And I know you have in the deck the destroyer as well. And I guess looking at the hull of that, is all of this going to culminate in permanent robotics and permanent sensors being put onto these things, or is that cost prohibitive in some way, or just too bulky and too much maintenance in and of itself? Because based on what you're learning, maybe the sensors should just be built into everything in the same way. I know this is like a minor analogy here, but like AirTags, the act of finding your stuff is going to be built into other devices. I think like the Apple remote controls have AirTags built into them essentially. And so it does seem to me that based on all your learning and the stuff, man, they should just be putting these sensors in a lot of different places permanently or have these robots permanently installed because the robots currently have an inspector working with them, correct? They have to be supervised. They're not like, we're not at the point where like these robots just exist in a little cabin and go up every week and inspect and go back like a droid in Star Wars, right? We're not at that level yet.
No, and I don't know if you need to be, actually. You want to do what you said, which is once you build something, you want to understand what's the health of that structure. So JK, what I believe is like in the next like 5 to 7 years, like you won't be able to build new things without first understanding the health of that asset on its construction. And you create a digital twin that is able to be updated as well with sensors that you build into these structures, especially structures that are really important like the nuclear sub. And what you want to do is instead of the sub saying it's going to last, 40 years, it's going to last 50 years, that actually can be doubled. So you want to be able to, you want to make sure that you can create something that can be updated every time that you're doing some turnaround. And then eventually maybe even don't need to spend 18 months in dry dock to do an evaluation of the health of the structure, which is currently the state of a lot of our Navy. So like a third of our Navy is currently in dry dock, trying to do its maintenance cycles, which means that a third of our Navy is not out there patrolling the seas and ensuring that conflict is being deterred. So it's actually a pretty large problem that Secretary of Navy Del Turo and I have talked about like a lot, actually, is just the schedule adherence and also understanding what is the state of the structures as we build them and how do we ensure that we're creating these living models of these critical assets.
You could cut that dry dock time in all of these cases down by 50%. You think ultimately 90%?
Well, the goal should be actually like don't spend any time if you can help it.
Continuous monitoring. So that if you're inspecting a battleship or a submarine, you could have it at the surface. If it's a submarine, obviously the ship is already at the surface. You could have underwater robots inspecting the hull while it's out in the ocean.
Yeah, you can. I mean, there's like a 2% gain in efficiency if you can like scrub a hull while you're like while a ship is going from like one place to the other, just because of like barnacle and build up on the hull of a ship. There's a bunch of things you can do to improve the efficiencies of existing critical infrastructure. But I think the big thing we should be orienting to is just like how do you not be so reactive and incentivize a model which is currently incentivized for time and materials, right? So whenever you have like these large maintenance primes, they are incentivized to have the maintenance cycle last as long as it can possibly last.
Right. Show me an incentive, I'll show you the outcome.
Exactly.
The longer it's in dry dock, the more the meter's running.
Right.
You are a big threat to maintenance companies because you'll tell them you only need to do maintenance on this 20%, the other 80% is fine.
Well, I think it's not a threat. It's like it's orienting the outcome towards like improved performance. And so it's a how do you actually it's just like power by the hour was like the old Rolls-Royce model. It's like how do you get paid for the amount of uptime you're producing? That should be the orientation. It should be like
that's what should be the incentive. Is how do you keep this thing in service, not how much service do you do? And that's really hard to do because then you have an incentive the other way. Hey, we got to keep this thing flying. And maybe you put something up there in the air that shouldn't be flying and should be in dry dock and should be inspection. And what you're trying to do is get to the truth. And the truth shall make you free. If you actually have the truth, you don't need to. If you can get to ground truth here, first principles, you're going to not have to try to game an incentive.
But also, yeah, exactly. But when you build new things, like think about it. This is what I get excited about. When you build new things, you want to be able to learn from the experience of the billions of iterations of that thing being in use every single day. We don't do that right now. We don't. We can model as much as we want about how to build the best sub or how to build the best destroyer or how to build the best refinery or new hydrogen conversion power plant. But we haven't learned from what's the impact of the equipment in operations and use. That's what we have to figure out because you can't build new infrastructure unless you're learning from how the old ones are working. And this is why it's so important to there's so much sex appeal to building new things. And like in 10 years, we'll have this really cool new autonomous thing, drone, walking, humanoid, that's going to solve all of these problems. But the problem is there's a lot of issues going on today. And so the approach to solving and using, specific robots for specific jobs is actually just to earn the right to begin building really cool robots that are that are able to do like, more interesting things. But you got to get the business model right. And the business model has to incentivize and make a CEO or a CFO give a fuck about, how useful these industry, 4.0 principles and tools are. Because right now that's not true. And you can hire, I see this time and time again where like, I won't name like the AI companies, but like these AI companies come in and say, well, like, completely turn on your head the way you're operating, your entire business. And they'll come in for some contract that ends up expiring because it just did not produce. And that's the problem. It's like you think you have all the information and data, but you're building your AI and your solutions off of ground truth. That's actually not ground truth. There's actually a low amount of integrity if you're not interrogating the data all the way to to the ground level. And so for us, like we are building AI and software, but off of like data sets that robots and smart sensors are actually collecting. In order to affect some large business outcome, EBITDA and cash flow is what we orient to. Or it could be schedule adherence, or it can be environmental impacts. But you have to be able to interrogate the impact from the solutions all the way down to like what's actually causing the change. And for us, it's very clear. Like if you can start with a core foundation of what is the health of everything of my built structures, then what we've actually found is that we don't have to ask our customers for data sets; they'll give it to us. And so the end of that case study I was going to show you was those 50 tanks. We actually were able to extend the useful life of that one tank by 10 years and scrap an $8 million CapEx expense. And we were able to, across the 50 assets, the site said, and did an analysis that predicted because of a modulation in fill heights, we were able to actually impact gross margin by about 4%. And so there's like these, it has to be oriented towards the outcome. So the customer has to buy that outcome. They can't buy the robots, and we'll be happy to use and integrate. And we do other sorts of robots because I don't want to build all the robots. But it has to be, again, oriented towards the big outcome and problem for the customer. Otherwise, like, it's not going to get funded.
What's the point? Yeah. I mean, there's a use for doing deep tech and there's a use for just trying to make things work in the world. But at a certain point, they have to solve a problem. And I think what you learned was, the robot was one way to solve the problem, but the sensors is another way to do it, right? And those sensors being on there, and it was incredible progress you've made. Let's talk a little bit about AI. We'll open the aperture here. As you collect all this data, and over the next 10 years, you'll have systems fail. You'll have things you got right. You'll have things you got wrong. Weird things will happen. Random things will occur. Ships will lose power and run into bridges. All kinds of events are going to occur. And you're going to be collecting all this data about these things. And then AI will be able to process all that and maybe give us some insights. When do you think you'll start having insights powered by AI a human wouldn't have gotten to in a reasonable amount of time? And what do you think the insights might look like? What might you figure out collecting all this data and then, running algorithms, machine learning, other things against it? Yeah.
We've collected now and own data sets on the health and structural integrity of over 500,000 of the world's most critical assets. And what we're doing is we're capturing this immense amount of information as it relates to what is going on as it relates to why are things damaged? Why are they? What kind of damage mechanism is occurring? And also building out machine learning to interpret what is a sound wave attenuation indicative of what kind of like issues. And so we've been able to train actually on what is causing certain sort of damage mechanisms because we've been labeling for the past 11 years. And so it's like it's the AI that we believe very very much in is like, let's be masters and very excellent at being the best in the world at understanding why things are damaged, what kinds of materials, what kinds of repair techniques, what kinds of inputs as it relates to what kind of variables are leading to certain kinds of damage mechanisms, to be able to begin to inform and inform what to expect as it relates to how to predict when something would fail. And then also how do you increase the efficiency, maybe a thermal efficiency or batch throughput, or even like a motor efficiency, detecting when a motor is about to fail and how to make sure you're adjusting it to be optimum. But basically, when you want to create efficiencies off of this like core information and data sets that we have that no one else does, which is
you'll be able to go back to the people who manufacture these tanks, the integration firms that actually install them, and the construction companies, and say, you know what? what we've seen when you're, within 100 miles or 50 miles of the coastline, salt water is X, Y, and Z. These tanks should be built in the following way. Or this is what happens in extreme heat. This is what happens in extreme cold. This is what happens from sun damage. There might be silly things like a certain coat of some sealant in one area might solve problems. And you can even start A/B testing this, right? You could tell this person with 50 tanks, hey, we're multivariate test it. We want to have 10 layers put on these, 5 layers put on these, 3 layers put on these, and want these other ones to be in the shade. I'm coming up with stupid ideas here, but just there's no bad ideas when it comes to testing, extending the life of critical infrastructure, right? And
yeah, that's right.
Man, that's going to be super powerful. Have you started to give manufacturers like notes or installation people notes like on how to do things better from the get?
We have not opened up that products or services as it relates to helping improve the OEM process and what materials to choose and otherwise. But you're correct in assuming like that's where our heads are at, as well as assuming who cares a lot about this stuff? Well, insurance companies do, right? Because they're insuring all these assets, they're insuring the downtime from these assets, and so these data sets are actually quite interesting as it relates to the carrot and stick of adopting these kinds of tools, because the insights of how well is my $1 billion of infrastructure being taken care of, right now is being informed by Joe in a row. So there's a lot of.
If you can measure it and you can manage it and you can insure it. Everybody says if you measure it, you can manage it. Managing it in a lot of cases means insuring it. Actually, Freeberg, who I think was the one who brought you guys up on a recent All-In pod, and which is why I invited you, he did Metro Mile, which was also measuring, hey, how many miles are you doing? We should only charge you for that. And then you start thinking about Teslas. They have a driving score. I don't know if it's still in the app, but one of the people who was driving my car is quite an aggressive driver at times. And it was like, whoa, you're driving pretty close to the person in front of you. It has the distance, it has the speed, zip, zip, zip. And you could just make insurance for people who are zippy in their cars and people who are slow-mos in the right-hand lane. And you could just right-size insurance. What you're saying is, hey, with these tanks, if we're inspecting them and we're doing, this remediation, well, maybe we should have a different insurance profile than somebody who does none of that. And if we're putting these sensors on here, boom, we should have a different level of insurance. That's exactly what happens in journalism, by the way. When I first started my first magazine, they were like, do you do fact checking? Do you check quotes with the folks who did it? Do you record your calls? And they went through all this stuff. And I was like, oh, wow, this is really interesting. I'm like, why does this matter? Like, well, we're going to make different levels of insurance based on your fact checking. So media insurance, people don't know this. If you're, I don't know. And I don't even know if some people like Alex Jones, take like an extreme example, who like does conspiracy theories and whatever, like uninsurable. And then you go to people like, I don't know, New York Times. And if you've ever been in a New York Times story, like, do they check the facts? Do they call you and confirm the quotes? No. Yeah. New Yorker, at least in my experience, I haven't had a New York Times fact checker check, but I have had the New Yorker check, have had Vanity Fair check. So Condé Nast does a really good job of that. And the insurance, I think, works out being proportional to the effort you put into getting your facts correct. And here it's, the effort you put into getting your sensors correct. Have insurance companies started collaborating with you yet or no?
They've reached out and they've come inbound, but we basically just held to the approach of, look, we're very focused on like helping improve the state of our customers' largest problems and orient us to value creation. We'll be more interested in those kinds of models that we're talking about as relates to OEM and insurance at some point in the future. But right now, it's just, we want to build out the infrastructure and a good architecture to begin implementing this this industry 4.0 type of like talk and in a pragmatic way. That's also trying to meet the customers where they're at. I mean, a lot of these customers have a hard time and are very adverse to technologists, software and robotics like folks coming in, because they just have not seen the impact towards like helping them fight the fires that they fight every single day. And so they're not actually that willing to give you like much information to help you build a good product stack. And I think this is why the death of so many, drone companies or robotics companies or software companies occur in this sector, is because one, venture capitalists have no idea about these sectors and what they're talking about. And so we were very much a black sheep because we were this like Pittsburgh robotics company focused on energy. These are all the wrong things back in 2016 when I went through YC.
In 2016, yes. And in 2024, now everybody's got the bug, right? After they've seen what's happened with Tesla and SpaceX. And that opened
Absolutely.
the wedge up to, hey, some of these
as well.
boring industries or, real world industries might be worth
Yeah.
going after. And it was also Uber and Airbnb were also real world businesses. I remember when they were raising their funding, people were like, I don't want to be in a real world business. It's too dangerous. What if somebody trashes your apartment? It's like, well, people trash hotels every weekend.
Yeah.
Kind of what hotels are for, at least amongst addicts and rock stars, is for trashing them. And like hotels have figured out how to deal with a trashed hotel room. They just throw everything in. They charge the person money for trashing it. The end.
Yeah.
It's part of the game.
Again, here in Pittsburgh, there's so many robotics companies that like start and die all the time. And it's because it's not because they are really dumb at building like great robots and solutions. They're actually like really smart. But the problem is, what are the robots like useful for?
Yes,
and that's like the big issue. And that's why I spend so much time. We spend so much time like trying to dig in with the customers in an embedded way. Because if you aren't
the
embedded,
bear hug is so critical. If a founder gets anything out of our hour together, it's the bear hug works. Being on location. And there was a famous story I think Paul Graham told of telling, or Joe Gebbia told it on this podcast, the co-founder of Airbnb. He said, all the customers were in New York, and Paul Graham told them, go to New York. And he said, all the places with good pictures get rented. The places without pictures don't get rented. He said, go to New York and take pictures and get a good camera. And they literally bought a digital SLR and started taking great pictures, I think.
Yeah.
Literally, Brian and Joe took the pictures themselves as the co-founders. And this is like, the closer you get to the customers, the closer you get to the truth. It should seem obvious, but it's scary to talk to customers for some introverted builders, engineers, whatever. You just got to be right there at their desk, sitting side by side with them, solving the problem together. And I think that's what you learned. And some customers don't want that, right? But you only need one or two to say yes, and then they get the benefit. So if you're on the customer side of this, if you let a startup embed with you, not embed with an E, if you embed a startup in your company, you get all the gains years before your competitors. So if you're in a big company, embed those startups and take a risk with them and help them build the future with you. That's what you were able to do, which is just so brilliant.
I think the thing that like it's important for listeners to understand too is like in a very regulated environment where especially there's a lot of monopolies at play, whether it be the government sector or it be the energy sector, like change is like very disincentivized. So you don't want to like change the way you're maintaining something that could go boom and kill people and take down a refinery that's making $50 million a day. So that's actually not that intuitive or accepted for folks to say, hey kid, come on and give your best shot. That was effective was actually in the power sector, and specifically the fossil fuel power sector, which were just like, hell, like I need help because I've got less funding, I've got less people, I've got less expertise, and my demand is actually like pretty high still. And like I'm having shutdowns of my power plants 50% of the year because pressure vessels just keep exploding.
Another way to look at this is what's at stake. I always tell founders, like, how much is at stake here? And if you're doing the family trip planning app, every time we get pitches in, like every 100th one or every 200th one is, I'm making an app that takes your group chat and lets you plan a trip in an app. And you're like, not a lot at stake. And the solution of doing it in iMessage or whatever WhatsApp you're into, it works out just fine. It's like enough. Like there's not much at stake here, like splitting the bill. It's like it's $100 in Mexican food. You got to split it 4 ways. Nobody cares. It's not enough at stake. Then you start looking at, hey, getting to space, putting stuff in space, SpaceX, a lot at stake. Self-driving, getting from point A to point B. There's actually a lot at stake in, Uber's business or Airbnb's. Like I'm going on vacation. I need a place to stay. There's a lot at stake there. And what you found is like, man, if one of these things fails, that's $500 million. And that's insurance companies. People lose their jobs at the company. People get sued. I mean, that's a lot at stake. And as you said in that one example, you extend that one tank, you save $8 million. And you probably made, what, 800,000 off that customer or 80,000 off that customer?
A little bit more than that. But yeah, it's
a little more than 80 or a little more than 800?
A little more than 800.
Okay. So essentially, if you made a little more, you were 15% of the cost of the other reality. So they got 85% of the benefit. You got 15.
Pretty happy.
Ballpark.
Yeah. Pretty happy.
That's where like I think technology is at its best when the customer gets the bulk of the gain and the company gets a small portion of the gain. It makes it a no-brainer.
Yeah. And also, like, you have to understand that these sectors are trying like hell to figure out how to adopt technology and not be sold like a bag of goods that is false. And so like what you end up have to do is create a model that very clearly you can backtrack into where is the value creation happening, but also how do I sort through like the 10 to 20 different like options for robotics and drones and AI companies. Like that's really tough for these large organizations, and they really just want like someone to come in and solve like a bunch of their problems. And so like if you can create an environment where you can bring in and vet technology, you can vet different kinds of robotics tools, fixed sensors that are enabled by some smart technology, you end up putting together the different pieces that make up some large outcome that you're trying to solve for the customer, packaged though in a software that helps to centralize decision making and very clearly articulates where the value creation is coming from, and you can interrogate how those decisions were made and what inputs led to the improved outcome. So you actually need to help, in order to like have a lot more startups enter this sector, you need to actually create a model that very clearly articulates like what the product market fit needs to be, or what the problem you have to solve needs to be, what the data layer that needs to be added to the stack like needs to end up looking like, or what kind of information you need to end up collecting that's not currently out there. And so that model, like, that's actually like is pretty. We're going to do this with now a half dozen like other robotics companies where we're like, hey, come under our contracts, and we really love the solutions that you're building. You can come under our contracts and add these different solutions.
Wonderful. Yeah. Hey, you've got a great drone, a walking drone, underwater drone. We don't have it. Yeah, we'll plug it in. Here's the API. Let's rock.
And this is where I see the humanoid robots going. It's like these are really complicated problems to solve. And the data that robots collect in the real world is interesting, but it's not actually super valuable to some customer that's trying to solve how do I increase the efficiency of my like batch process of making a roll of steel. So like the robots can do interesting tasks and can actually observe interesting data in the real world and get information that's not previously available. However, what is the use of that information as it relates to solving some large outcome for a client? So that's how like I'm excited about humanoids and walking dog robots, because that offers like different data layers, but like they're one of a couple different data layers that you need.
There'll be 1,000 flowers are going to bloom in robotics. I mean, these little ones to carry your burritos from point A to point B. I mean, if you just watch Star Wars or any modern science fiction, you're going to see a range of robots and science fiction authors and directors and creatives, they really do think about human use cases. And sure enough, these little robots that would scurry past Darth Vader's feet look just like the ones that are delivering burritos in a lot of major cities. And sure, we'll have a C-3PO, we'll have an R2-D2, we'll have everything in between. And the build of materials on your robots is a little bit high because you have some really intense sensors.
Yep.
So those look like those could be tens of thousands of dollars, I assume, in terms of the BOM.
Yeah, it's like it's like close to six figure is about where it is. But it's not. We're not optimizing for the BOM. But yeah, that's right.
But when you look at the general robot, Optimus or Figure or some of these, the BOM on those is going to be, what do you think? If you had to pick a number 5 years from now, what's the build of materials? And then we can extrapolate pricing for consumers after that. What do you think, like a functional robot that could walk your dog, or I don't know, do your dishes, or I don't know, tidy up around the house, or work in a factory? What do you think without the specialized sensors, what do you think the BOM on one of those is going to be?
It's going to be interesting because you also like have to think about like what kind of certifications like the robot has to like have or come under. Sure. But I think it'll end up being, it's going to be hard for me to imagine it's below 40 in 5 years. I think it's actually be a lot higher than that. Because those are early on, but ultimately you think a $40,000 BOM? Yeah, but ultimately I think a $40,000 BOM makes sense in the next
That's higher than I thought. I thought it was going to be more like 20 or so. Yeah, in the next 7 years, I think it'll end up going down basically just based on what kind of like volume. So I'm not assuming like in 7 years a lot of volume. If there's a lot of volume, then I'd probably estimate it's closer like to the 20K. I think it'll get to 10, and it'll get cheaper than that coming out of China. Absolutely. Yeah. So 40 when they launch, 10 ultimately when they're commoditized, everything in between. And what are the major costs you think in that robot? What are the top 2 or 3 costs that you're going to need? The actuators are the big thing.
I think the compute is also going to be like expensive. I'm not sure how that will be dealt with.
Yeah. Does it have like the equivalent of, an H100 powering it, or does it have like a MacBook and it's connected to the net? It's like a very interesting question.
There'll be a lot of robots that like, there's certain robots that won't be able to go into certain environments unless they're like certified for explosion proof. And it's like, those are expensive.
Yeah.
To get the certification and to ensure that they won't combust, for example.
Yeah. Battery life comes to mind. But the actuators are what make them move, their arms, the equivalent of your joints, essentially, and the pulley system to move things around. Those are not cheap right now.
Yeah, and like fine dexterities. Those are really tricky.
The hands, we had a company, Root AI, that was picking strawberries with the MIT hand.
Oh yeah.
And, some of these MIT hands are so incredible what they are capable of doing. Then we have Cafe X picking up coffee cups and making lattes and putting foam on them. And we thought it would crush the cup. And how does it do it? And it's like, oh no, cups are easy. Like, we're working with berries. Really, you're working with berries? Like, we're pulling strawberries and raspberries. Like, we're talking about fragile berries off of stems. It's not an easy task when you think about it. But I guess in some ways it is. And then you could actually see these being rented for $10 a day, $20 a day. $10 a day is $3,600 a year. $20 a day is $7,000 a year. Yeah, $20 a day is what people spend on lunch now. So $20 a day to have a robot's pretty dope in my mind.
I think maybe less about like the commercial, the B2C implications, mostly just because like the amount you have to spend on getting that last 10% for robotics and the amount of time.
Edge cases.
The edge cases are just like so hard and expensive. So in my opinion, it more aligns to like what kind of value are you creating from the robots, and then if you can create a lot of value and charge a lot, then you can justify like large amounts of spend onto making some really cool robotics. So I think that's the key that most roboticists haven't actually solved for: is what is the value creating and how much can you extract from the value you create. Once you do that, then you have a vicious cycle of being able to optimize those robotics to do some really cool things. And I think that's at least the way that I'm approaching it, because I don't have, $5 billion to spend on R&D.
You seem good at picking markets. Where would you send the first humanoid robotics to maximize the business model? Soldiers? Welders?
Soldiers.
Soldiers come to mind. Think about how much money we put into a soldier. I had a friend who was a Green Beret. Yeah. And he was like, he told me he was like a $5 million asset. He said the SEALs are like a $20 million asset each, based on their cumulative training,
I think robotics will not get used in warfare unless there's like some large conflict. And then it'll be like, then we have bigger problems than robotics.
End of humanity problems. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think it's like, you can't send like robotics into some village because like the edge cases, right? It's like, there's so much potential issue. And then you're dealing with like a large PR problem if you're like a large government, right? I think it's ultimately going to be where the cost of, where the human exposure and the cost of potentially having like a large issue because of like some sort of OSHA violation or something like that. So my mind just goes to like, what is the most
deep sea welding is dangerous.
Deep sea welding is like the one actually in my head I was going to, because it's, that's one of the most dangerous jobs. Your life expectancy is like 4 years. And
is it 4 years? Wow, that's wild.
Something like that. It's like people get paid like hundreds of thousands of dollars to go do that job. I think it's like $500K was like a going rate for like an undersea welder. But like your life expectancy is like,
turns out.
Trees are dangerous. Very
roofers,
dangerous.
Construction workers, truck drivers, miners.
I don't think roofers, just because it's I don't think welders.
Firefighters also very dangerous, running into burning buildings.
I think it's like, what is the cost? Like, what is the value you can create, like from the information that the robots are collecting? I think your mind's going more to like labor, which I think makes sense. But I think I'm more interested in like
that's where ChatGPT's mind went. I just did a ChatGPT. What's the most dangerous professions? Logging's up there. You think about it, logs falling everywhere and like heavy duty machinery with chainsaws and blades and if you ever seen those logs like roll down a hill, man, you're dead if you get hit by one of those, man. Game over.
I think that it'll end up just being oriented towards maybe on the labor side undersea welding, but I actually think it's more just like walk downs at refineries. It's it's welding and perfecting the weld speeding up the time of the weld, but it's more oriented towards like what kind of new information am I getting in a way that's that helps to improve the overall state of a let's say like of the organism that is like making a roll of steel or paper products or refining petroleum or making power.
Yeah.
It's those types of things.
Factory work comes to mind as a good first step too, right? I think that's what Elon's thinking is if I can get him to work in the Tesla factory on repetitive tasks in a controlled zone.
So I'm actually
no humans to get run into.
Right. What I'm thinking more of is like what kind of information is being collected by the robot that helps improve an overall process that a human, is not constantly streaming data somewhere, right? It's constantly streaming to your head, and that never gets.
Best example of that.
So let's say like you're walking down a refinery and you're looking at and trying to listen for different kinds of noises that might be indicative of some like leak somewhere, or like you're looking at, you're trying to like look at like temperature transmitters and see if there's like some kind of inconsistency of temperature that like could lead to something going boom. You can use like things like thermal cameras. You can use things like you can use things like lidars as well to like constantly update like what's the process of refining petroleum. You can begin to like incorporate different kinds of pieces of information that can tell you how efficient is your facility operating at, and then update whatever model you're using and change the way that you're actually operating the facility. Because ultimately,
it's the lessons they would learn in the field that could be incorporated into a better process that you're saying.
Basically, it's like we know very little about what's going on in the real world, and so like robots or like cars that are going around with lidar spinning all the time, they're collecting very interesting information and data that is being monetized in like interesting ways that we don't even hear about or talk about. But it's that same sort of application. They know population
density. They know how popular Broadway is in your town at 1:00 on a Sunday.
Measuring emissions is a big thing too. Like it's like if you're like if you have a robot walking around and doing tests of how much CO2 is coming out of my stack. It's like these are like interesting, different kinds of information that can drive, certain sorts of large outcomes. Maybe it's like some sort of premium you can get from the Inflation Reduction Act or something like that.
It's fascinating. I think it's going to be like a brave new world. Can't wait for these things to come out. All right, listen, Gecko Robotics, Jake, another overnight success, 11 years in the making. Congratulations, keeping us safe. I mean, I was just thinking about that building in Miami. Remember the pool and that building collapsed in Miami?
Yeah.
Man, if they had just been and they kind of knew that it was messed up, but they just didn't take it seriously. They didn't inspect it. Man, you get a couple of those happening. And there are other countries where the building standards are not like the US. And that happened in the US. Man, and I don't know what developing nations now are getting rich and have a lot of buildings that were built maybe when they weren't as rich and there weren't as much regulation, going back and figuring out, hey, these buildings built in, I'm thinking of emerging countries that are now, we don't use the term first and third world anymore, but frontier markets turning into emerging markets, turning into primary markets. They're going to need to inspect some of that previous infrastructure and make sure it's tighter.
There's an interesting stat. It's like there's 17,555 bridges in New York. And I think 6 was the latest are not in need of immediate repairs. So it's like this stuff's old and
I just went over the Verrazano Narrows and it was rusted and gross. And that's like one of the premier bridges in New York. It's really sad to see.
And then also just like, you don't think about it, but in the US, you can reduce, Roe does this interesting study. 18% is the reduction in US emissions by 2030 if you can stop critical assets from failing and exploding within the oil and gas and manufacturing sector. So it's like, these are like pretty interesting, connection points into how important it is to understand the health of the built world that most people don't think about.
Yeah, and that's a hard one to sell on unless there's just been something terrible that's happened on an infrastructure basis and people are highlighted to it because people don't want to talk about the reality of another BP oil spill in the Gulf or another bridge collapsing. It's just, it's dark to think about it, but great that there are people like you out there solving these problems so the rest of us can feel safer. Great job, Jake.
Thanks.
Wish you continued success, and we'll see you all next time on This Week in Startups. Bye-bye.